Welcome to week 3 of our series called Going Under. And man, I think the things that we have been talking about over the last several weeks in this series Going Under have just been critically important as we've really unpacked this conversation about what it means to live with margin. And if you're kind of just jumping in, if this is your first weekend here over the course of this series, let me just catch you up real quick. Really, the whole idea behind this series is that we all experience seasons in our life. Every single one of us, we experience seasons in our life. Some of us are in those seasons right now. Some of us, those seasons have been in the past, but we've all gone through seasons where we feel these things right here. We feel overworked. We feel overscheduled. We feel overextended. We feel overworked. Maybe that's literally at work because of all the projects, that you're taking on. Maybe that's not necessarily at work. Work is fine, but then when you come home, you've got all these projects you got to do. You just feel overworked. Some of us, it's overscheduled. It's your calendar. It's busyness. We'll talk about that more here today. And then some of us, we just feel overextended. We feel overextended financially. We feel overextended emotionally. We feel overextended relationally, mentally. So we've all experienced seasons in our life where we felt like this. Where we felt this way. This is why we say things. I don't know if you've ever heard someone say a phrase like this, or maybe you've said something to this degree before when you were in the season. You say, I just feel like I'm drowning. I feel like I can't keep my head above water. I just feel like I'm treading water right now. It's all a way of describing this. It's all a way of saying that I feel like I'm going under. And the reason we feel that way is actually really, really simple. It's a reality that's true for every single one of us. It's true about you. It's true about me. It's true about everybody. We all have limits. We all have a line. We all have limits. It doesn't matter who you are. We have limits financially. We have limits relationally. We have limits with our energy. We have limits physically. We have limits with our time. We all have limits. And anytime we try to push our lives above the limits that we have, that's when we experience pain. When we reach those limits, when we feel overworked and overscheduled and overextended, we're at that point, we're seeing our limits, we're reaching our limits, and we're pushing past it, and that's when we experience pain. And of course, the opposite side of that is, the antithesis of that is just health, right? It's those seasons of our life where we don't feel those things, and we feel our best selves. We feel alive in ways that maybe we haven't felt before. And in between health, and this is really kind of the summary of the whole series, what we've been talking about, in between health and pain is this wide gap right here that we've just been calling margin. The margin exists between health and pain, that it's in this space right here, like this is the sweet spot right here. And we don't want to push up against those limits of pain, but rather we want to live our lives with margin. Margin is that place where an unexpected visit can happen. A friend can pop by unexpectedly, and you're not sitting there looking at your watch the whole time. That's margin. Margin is that space where you have, time to be able to give to someone who maybe just needs it in the moment. Margin is that place where you have the ability to give money to someone or something that your heart is stirred by, and you can give that money and not feel like you're going to cross that line. Margin is that place where you can wrestle with your kids and you're not going to be left physically exhausted because you've been taking care of your body. That's margin. This right here, this is fatigue. This is energy. This is more debt, more debt, more debt. This is having money left over at the end of the month. This is hurry. This is calm. This is anxiety. And this is peace. And it's just so much better way to live. And what we've been saying over the last couple of weeks is that you have a heavenly Father. At the end of the day, above it all, you have a heavenly Father. You have a God who created you, who wants you to live here. He doesn't want you to live a life where you're constantly living at this line here of pain, of stress, and of burnout. But rather, he wants you to live with margin. And the trick to this is, as much as God desires this for our lives, we still have to make choices to live here. And the way that you make a choice to live with margin is actually pretty simple. Here's how you create margin in your life. We create margin by choosing to limit the load that we carry so we don't live beyond our limits. It's pretty simple. We create margin. If you want to know how to create margin in your life, this is kind of the big principle. We create margin by choosing to limit the load we carry so that we don't live beyond our limits. So if we only make $100, let's just say that's our limit, we spend less than $100. Kind of simple. We limit the load that we carry. If this is our limits physically, we limit the load that we carry. If this is our limits with our time, we limit the load that we carry. The problem is, and you've experienced this and I've experienced this, we've all experienced this, we do not live in a culture that values margin. You and I live in a world that values more and pushes us. More productivity, more things, more activities, more success, more projects. It's constantly bombarding us. All sorts of people have an agenda for your life and an agenda for my life. And will always push us here to keep pushing us towards those lines and our limits. Which is why we have to fight. If you want margin in your life, we have to fight and scratch and claw our way towards that at times. And so today, I want to dig a little bit deeper into what it would look like to create margin in our schedule in particular. Remember that middle word a moment ago? It was like sometimes we feel overscheduled. So I want to talk about time today, specifically. And what it feels like when we are bumping up against our limits with our time, because you all know that time is it's a finite thing, it's a limited resource, and so we have our limits. We literally have limits on time because there's 24 hours in a day. And you know what it feels like, don't you, to experience pain when it comes to your schedule, when it comes to the way that we're viewing our time. And if you don't, let me just give you some quick little diagnostic test real quick. If you've ever prayed, God, please make it rain, so my kid's game is canceled, right? You're probably living at this line right here, right? Some of you, that's the only prayer you've ever prayed. You've never even prayed another prayer. It's just like, to whom it may concern, I need it to rain, please. Some of you, for you, it's not maybe that. You just hope that the meeting that you've scheduled just gets canceled because you could use that hour back. For some of you, when you're adding 4 shots of espresso to your already very highly caffeinated drink just so you have the energy to get through your day, you're probably living here. When you constantly feel tired and that you can't get ahead on your projects, you're probably living here. When you're consistently showing up late and you're consistently leaving early, you're probably living on that line and at your limits. And here's what's interesting to me. The most common approach, you've felt this, we've all felt this kind of this pain with our schedule at times. And the most common approach to addressing this is to do what? To get more efficient. To just get more efficient. We're gonna do things better so we can what? Do more things. So we try to get way more efficient, but that doesn't solve anything because we just create more efficiency so we can do more things. In reality, what we try to do is we try to manage our time, but let me just say this real quick, and this is kind of an underlying premise of the whole day today. Time management is a myth. You really, literally, you can't manage time because time is not something you can control. You can't manage time because you can't stop it, you can't pause it, you can't fast forward it, you can't slow it down. You can only manage yourself. Time management is an absolute myth. What you and I need most is self-management when it comes to the way we use our time. Because we have more tools at our disposal than ever before. At any point in history, we have more tools at our disposal for efficiency, and yet we are busier than ever. And we are living at that line, and some of us are experiencing pain. And you don't have to. Because what you need most, what I need most, is not more efficiency. We need a new perspective on time if we want to live with margin. Now, there's a writer in the Old Testament who gives us a perspective on time that I think is absolutely brilliant. It's a fascinating perspective that he gives us. His name was Moses. And if anyone has the credibility and the authority to be able to speak and to talk about time, it's Moses. Because Moses had seen throughout his life all sorts of different ways of approaching and viewing time. He grew up, if you didn't know this, he grew up in Pharaoh's palace in the kingdom of Egypt. And so he gets to see, even though he wasn't an Egyptian, he was kind of adopted into to Pharaoh's family. And so he gets to see firsthand how a kingdom is ruled. He gets to see how Pharaoh and Pharaoh's court use their time to rule a kingdom. So he gets a master class in leadership when he sees how these leaders use their time. But then there's a point in his life where he's exiled from Egypt and he has to run out into the wilderness. And for the next 40 years of his life out in the wilderness, he's a shepherd. You could not be more, you couldn't get more diametrically opposed as far as context goes, from the palace of Pharaoh to now out in the wilderness by himself with a bunch of sheep, just every day for 40 years watching whatever sheep do. And he's bored, and he has a completely different kind of perspective on time at this point. But then God calls him up into something so much greater and says, Moses, I got something so much greater for you. I want to free my people from slavery. The Hebrew people had been enslaved to Egypt for hundreds of years, and he says, I'm going to use you, Moses, to do it. And Moses goes back and he leads the nation of Israel, the Hebrew nation, out of slavery. And they wander around, and now Moses, for the next 40 years, finds himself almost like in the CEO position of this newly formed people, this nation. He's the leader now. And so Moses has perspective on time. He understands time. If you're a CEO, he relates to you. If you're a farmer, he relates to you. He sees the whole gamut, and he has something to say to us. He gives this extraordinary gift to us, as you're about to see in just a moment, this extraordinary perspective on time. That if we are wise enough to take it to heart, it will be the key to creating margin in our life. This is what he says. He writes this down. This is in Psalm 90. This is the oldest psalm in all of the Bible. And he says this. He says, Lord, through all the generations, you have been our home. It's a pretty cool statement. He said, before the mountains were born, you gave birth to the earth and the world. From the beginning, listen to this, from the beginning to the end, you are God. Some translations there say from everlasting to everlasting. In other words, Moses is saying, God, you want to talk about perspective on time. God, what must it be like to see time from your vantage point? God, what must it be like to see time from your perspective? Because you're everlasting to everlasting. You are from beginning to end. In other words, before there even was any beginnings, God, you were. And you will be always for eternity. And so God, in light of how you see time, man, our lives and our existence must be like a blip on the radar to you. Which I think explains what he says next. Look what he says. He says, you turn people back to dust, saying, return to dust, you mortals. For you, 1,000 years are as a passing day, and brief as a few night hours. God, when you look at time, your perspective on time, man, 1,000 years must feel like a few hours to you. And he says this statement, which I think is so interesting. He says, you turn people back to dust, saying, return to dust, you mortals. It's almost like Moses is saying, in spite of that, in spite of how incredibly eternal you are and your perspective on time, yet you are still involved in our lives. You still have authority, God. You have authority over life and death. And some of you want to know that, don't you? You want to believe that. That maybe there is a God, maybe there is someone or something greater than yourselves that still has authority over life or death. Some of you don't even know what you really believe about the whole Jesus thing, and you're not even sure what you believe about God and all that, but you want to believe that there is someone or something greater that has authority over life and death. You know how I know you believe it? Why I believe it? We all believe this at some level. Is because whenever you are faced with mortality, maybe someone that's very close to you, they got a diagnosis, or maybe you saw a story on the news and it reminded you of your own mortality, whatever it is, you find yourself praying in that moment, don't you? And you have someone close to you who's gotten a prognosis and it's not good. And you're not even really the praying type, but you find yourself praying in that moment. And maybe your prayer is just simply like, oh my God. And it kind of erupts deep inside of you because what? Because you want to believe that in the grand scope of all this life, that there is still a God who has authority over life and death. Moses goes on, he says, you sweep people away like dreams that disappear. They are like grass that springs up in the morning. In the morning, it blooms and it flourishes, but then it's gone. By the evening, it's dry and it's withered. Say, man, God, life to you, in the context of how you see time, our life must just feel like a blip, man. It might just feel like a weed or a flower that springs up and it's gone. So short. And then he goes on a few verses later and says this, 70 years are given to us, Some even live to 80. By the way, let me just say real quick. I was talking to my son Silas this week. He's 10 years old. And we weren't even talking about this. He had no clue we were talking. This had nothing to do with our conversation. We were talking about football, I think. And in the middle of our conversation, Silas goes, we're talking, and he just goes, whoa, hey, whoa. You're more than halfway done with your life. I was like, thank you, son. You're grounded. So, according to Moses, he's right. So, but even the best years are filled with pain and trouble. Soon they will disappear, and we'll fly away. This is what I love about Moses. He's a realist. He's not, sugarcoating anything. It's not Pollyanna, philosophy here. He's saying, no. I've experienced pain. I've been driven out in the wilderness. I know what it feels like to have those things that I love most taken away from me. Moses says, yes, that's part of life. I know the ups and the downs. I know the joys and the heartaches. It's all part of it. And Moses is like, but there's good news soon. And I don't know if he means the troubles will disappear or you'll disappear and you'll fly away to eternity. But he's like, but don't worry, it'll all be over. You'll die one day. Yeah, you don't want to go to Moses if you want to pick me up, right? He's just going to tell you kind of straight up. And then he says this, and I almost feel like Moses is like, it's like his thought just wanders for a second. And we get this little glimpse into his journal, whatever he's writing on at this moment, and he has this thought that is just, this is crazy. He says, who can comprehend the power of your anger? Like if we were to comprehend, who can even do that? Who could comprehend the power of your anger? Your wrath is as awesome as the fear you deserve. Now this is a complicated little sentence, but let me just summarize what Moses is saying here. I think Moses is saying that if we were just for a second, a millisecond, if we were just for one brief millisecond able to see God in all of God's fullness, if we were able to just 1 second comprehend God in all of God's majesty and holiness and power and splendor, if we could just catch a very, very brief glimpse of that, we would give God all the respect that God deserves. It wouldn't be a question. Or since this is, in the context of time, Moses is writing about time, and our perspective on time, maybe another way of just saying this, I think part of what Moses is driving home here is that if we were just for a brief second able to see God in all of God's greatness and glory, that we would choose to use our time perhaps differently than we're using it. All of a sudden, the way we use our time might change. We might make different choices in light of that to give God the respect that God is due. And what Moses says next, this is the last little statement we'll look at from Moses, because it's like it all builds to this one statement. And this next statement that Moses makes is so filled with insight that it can actually, I think, change the way that we use our time altogether. He says this, so in light of all that, God, teach us to realize the brevity of life so that we may grow in wisdom. Teach us to realize how short our lives are. Some translations say to number our days. Teach us to realize the brevity of our life. Teach us, God, because we don't like thinking about the brevity of our life. Teach us, God, because we like to think that our time is limitless, when in fact it is very limited. Teach us because, God, we tend to put ourselves at the center of the universe and think we can just push off whatever we want to do most and the things that are most important until later, that there will be time left later, and later never comes. So teach us the brevity of life. Why? So that we'll have wisdom. So that maybe we will make more wise choices than ever before for how we spend our time and how we use our time. He says, teach us, God. Because it's interesting, isn't it, that when you begin to come face to face with the brevity of your life, when you're struck with that reality, isn't it interesting how practical the choices begin to shift by how you spend your time? Come on, you've seen this. You've seen this because you've probably seen someone before who got a diagnosis, and all of a sudden, they are forced to confront the brevity of their life. And it's interesting, isn't it? That when that happens, oftentimes the things that they had no time to do just a few days before, all of a sudden, they have time to do. The people and the relationships that they didn't have time for just a week before that, all of a sudden, there's plenty of time to invest in those relationships. Why? Because they have been given a gift. And it is the gift of wisdom. Because they know that their time is limited. They know that their time is limited. And I think what Moses is trying to say, and I think what Moses is trying to grab us by the shoulders in this moment and wake us up and say to us is, I think he's trying to say, you don't have to wait for a diagnosis to live with that kind of wisdom. You don't have to wait for some tragedy. You don't have to wait to be faced with your own mortality. You don't have to wait for that to live with that kind of wisdom. You can live with that kind of wisdom today. How? By recognizing that your time is limited. Maybe a way of saying it is this. Wise people know time is limited, so they limit what they do with their time. Wise people know that their time is limited, so they limit what they do with their time. They place limits on what they do. They place limits on who they're with. They place limits on those things because they know that their time is limitless. And wise people know that at the end of their days, you could get to the end of your days and have spent so much of your time here at this line right here, pushing up against pain, always having something to do, always pushing up against those pain limits and feeling stressed and feeling overworked and overscheduled and overburdened and all that. That you could get to the end of your days having done all of this, having lived here and wasted it. And it been so foolish because you missed what was most important. And I know some of you, even as I've been talking, you've been objecting. You've had your objections. You're like, yeah, but I got to keep cramming things in. I have to work better at this. I have to do more things because if I don't keep cramming things in, if I don't keep doing things, and I know it feels like I'm living here, and yes, it brings some stress, and yes, it feels like I'm on the edge of burnout every now and then, and yes, my life is crazy and all that kind of stuff, and I feel like I'm going under a little bit, but I have to because if I don't, I'm going to fall behind. To which I would just ask you, fall behind who? Well, my coworkers, my neighbors, my classmates. I mean, I'm sure you got a name for it. And that's cool. I mean, I understand. I felt that pressure. But I would just challenge you, and I'd say, there are some things maybe that could be worth in the end falling behind on. If it means you can actually live with wisdom. And sometimes chasing and chasing and chasing might be the most foolish thing you can do. Because you could accomplish it and you could get to the end of your days and have accomplished it all and traded away what's most meaningful. Or how about this one? Some of you are like, I know it's crazy and all that, but I don't want my kids to fall behind. I know it's crazy. I know we're going all over the place. I know, but I don't want my kids to fall behind. Fall behind who? Just challenge it. That's all I'm suggesting to you. Just challenge those assumptions. Fall behind who? Guys, why would you hand over your ability to live with margin to another family just to keep up? Why would you hand over your ability to live with margin to someone else? Why would you give them that kind of control in your life? And what I can promise you is true. And I'm going to speak for the people who are closest to you. I'm going to give a voice to them right now because these are things they want to tell you, but maybe can't tell you or don't tell you, or maybe they just never thought about it like this. But let me just tell you on behalf of them, the people who are closest to you, your spouse, your children, your coworkers, if you're single, your friends, the people in your fraternity, the people in your sorority, your roommates, whatever it might be. The people who are closest to you do not want, at the end of the day, the thing they want most from you is not for you to be successful. That's not what they need most. It's not for you to be accomplished. It's not for you to be really efficient. The thing that the people close to you need most from you is for you to be fully present to be here. To be here. And you know that's true because that's what you've wanted from the people that you're closest to. So in light of all this, I just want to end this by giving you 3 permissions, and I want to raise 3 questions for you, and then we're done. Pretty simple. Because I think if you're serious about this, if you want to create margin, remember, you're going to have to make choices to live below your limits. So it's a choice. And Moses is making us a promise here saying, if you'll do that, if you'll recognize that your time is limited, you're going to gain wisdom and you're going to live below those limits and you're going to experience a peace when it comes to your schedule, maybe like you've never experienced. So 3 permissions I just want to talk to you about. So the first one is this: because you realize, because you're going to be the kind of people, and I'm going to be the kind of person here, that we live with wisdom when it comes to our schedule. And so we're going to realize that our time is limited and we're going to limit the way we spend our time. So because you realize that your time is limited, here's the first permission. You have permission to say no. Because you realize your time is limited, you have permission to say no. Actually, here's how I'd say it. I'm going to bold that and put an exclamation mark. You have permission to say no. Now, by the way, I'm not talking about to your boss on this. Don't go to your boss tomorrow and be like, Pastor said that I don't know why you have a southern accent when you say that, but whatever. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about all the supplemental things you take on. The things you don't have to do necessarily. They're things that you feel like you have to do, but if you were to ask someone else, they'd say, no, you don't have to do that. You have permission to say no. And I love what Anne Lamott says, because some of you need to be freed with this reality right here, right now. No is a complete sentence. You don't have to explain why you make the schedule choices that you do. You don't have to explain why you're not doing all the crazy stuff that everybody else is doing. You don't have to explain it to anyone. When someone says they want your time, when someone says they need you at this, when someone says that you got to be about this, when someone says your kids need to be on that, you don't have to explain why you say no. You can just say no. No. Because I recognize my time is limited. So I'm going to limit the way I use my time. The other thing I'd say about this one is just that a no today is not a no forever. And sometimes the reason we say yes to things that we know are going to push us up against this limit, it's going to push us up against stress, is because we buy into this fear of missing out, this FOMO mentality. Like, if I don't take advantage of it now, it'll never come back around. No, a no today is not a no forever. That same opportunity or a better opportunity will be around 5 years from now, 6 years or 10 years from now, 20 years from now. And you may be in a season of life. I can't tell you how many times Jenny and I have had to say no to something because we're just like, it's just not the right season. Our kids are not at the right space, whatever it might be. But one day we will. A no today is not a no forever. And for some of you, the most important list you need to create today, in light of everything we're talking about, is not a to-do list. You're really good at your to-do list. You've got that thing down. You need to create a to-don't list. And you need to be as articulate about your to-don't list as you are about your to-do list. What are the things you will not do? Because you're not going to live here. We have a couple things on the to-don't list. One of my to-don't lists for Jenny and I is, our kids will not be involved in more than one activity at a time. We're just not going to do that. That's one for us. Another one on my to-don't list is I'm not going to be away from the home more than 2 nights out of the week. And don't get me wrong, it happens every now and then. It happens every now and then. I'm talking about in general, in principle. It happens every now and then because of church things or ministry things that are happening here. Sometimes I have to be home, out of the house for a couple more nights than 2, and then I just make it up the next week. So that week I'm not out any. But the point is, you need to be crystal clear about the vision you have for your life and your time, because wise people know their time is limited. So they limit what they do with their time. Last thing about this one right here, this permission, because I feel like I just need to say this to some of you. For some of you, it's not a thing you need to say no to. It's not an event you need to say no to. For some of you, it is a person. Because they are draining you. And I don't mean emotionally like you're giving to them. I mean they're draining you in the most negative sense. You're spending your time and you are giving your time to a person or a group of people who are leading you down destructive paths. And you know it. They are leading you places that is not God's best for you. And you know it. And if your heart started beating a little bit faster, that means you probably got a name in mind right now. And the no you need to give is you need to say, my time is limited. So I got to limit the time I spend with you. And maybe you don't articulate that to them. You just got to make that choice. You have permission to say no. Second permission, because you are going to live with wisdom and know that your time is limited, here's the second permission. You have permission to give things away. You have permission to give things away. For some of you, if you're a perfectionist, you need to hear this. Because you hold on to everything and you believe this lie and you believe this myth. I can't give that thing away. I can't give those things away. I can't let someone else do that. I can't give that project away. I can't let someone else clean my house. I can't let my kids clean my house. I can't let my kids mow my grass, whatever it might be. Because why? Because they won't do it as good as me. Let me just break it to you. You're right. They won't. But that's not the standard. The standard isn't to get someone, like you can only give someone away if someone can do it 100% as good as you. Here's the rule I've been trying to use over the last year, whatever. If someone can do a job that you're doing 80% as good as you can give it to them. Because at that point, it's about you and control if you're not willing to do that. You just want the control over it. And that's fine, but just know you're going to live here a lot. And don't you want to be wise? Because your time is limited. So you have permission to give things away. And for some of you, you need to give things away to a person. And for some of you, you need to give some of the things that you're doing away to a system. You need to create a system around, there are recurring activities that you are doing. And there's a system that can help alleviate some of the time that you're giving to those things. The most simple example of that is just bill pay, right? Automatic bill pay. Jenny and I have not paid a bill in I don't know how long. I mean, we paid our bills, but you understand what I'm saying. We haven't done any of that. Why? Because if you can automate it, automate it. If you can automate the things that are important and are recurring, then automate them. Because it'll create margin. It'll continue to create margin for you. The most important thing that we automate when it comes to, as we're talking about finances real quick, it's kind of a sidebar, is just our tithing and the money that we want to give. And so for us, we automate our tithing. The first 10% always will go to this church right here. And then we'll kind of look and we'll say, how do we automate some of the other things like sponsoring children and all that? But why would you not prioritize the things that are most important to you? Why would you not automate those things? So you can create a little bit more margin. Here's the last permission. If you want to live with wisdom, you got to know your time is limited. And because of that, you have permission to do less of the things that matter at the least. I want to give some of you this permission because you need it. You have permission to do less of the things that matter the least. Now, this is very different than the first one. The first one is some things you just need to say no to. This is not things you need to say no to. These aren't necessarily bad things. These are hobbies. This is entertainment. These are good things. But what's happened for some of us is it's gone unchecked how much time we're spending on them. We've just kind of let it go on unchecked, and it's time to dial it back. Because it's eating into our margin. And they just don't matter, some of them, like in the grand scheme of things, knowing that your time is limited. They're fun and they're good, nothing bad or wrong with them. They're not as important as some other things. Did you know that the average person who's retired, this is crazy, guys, 65 and up, the average 65-year-old and above watches 48 hours of television a week? So you didn't really quit a full-time job. You just kind of traded full-time jobs is what you did. And don't judge before you start judging them. The average person, an average American watches 9 years of television by the time they're gone. So what's interesting is this is not just, we can live here without any margin and not really be busy. We've just filled it with things that don't really matter. For some of you, I just want to give you that permission to do less of the things that matter the least. Those are your 3 permissions. Here's your 3 questions, and then we're leaving. Here it is. I just want you to think about these questions. I want you to answer these questions. What do I need to cut out in light of everything we've said today? What do I need to cut out of my schedule? What do I need to cut out? What do I need to give away? And what do I need to do less of? Kind of simple. What do I need to cut out? What do I need to give away? What do I need to do less of? Now, here's what I want to encourage you to do as strongly as I can possibly encourage you to do this. I want you to take these 3 questions. I want you to talk about these with someone that you trust. I want you to talk about these with friends. If you're in a group, I just gave you your next, your group assignment. If you're in a group here at our church, talk about this this is your content for your next time you get together as a group. Bring answers to it. If you're a family, if you've got kids, talk about this as a family. Talk about this with your spouse. If you've got roommates, if you're in college, whatever, talk about this with your roommates. If you're single, talk about it with your friends. Answer these questions. Because don't you want to live wisely? Wouldn't you want to know where these answers could lead if it meant you could live here? I think that if you will be honest and you will ask these questions, and then you'll be honest about the answers and where they lead, I think what you're going to find is that you're going to live with more margin. And you know what's going to happen to the people closest to you? They're going to be so grateful that you ask these questions. Your kids are going to thank you. And they may never say the words. They're going to thank you in the sense of their presence with you. And they're going to be so grateful that you lived with wisdom because you realized your time was limited. And your friends are going to be so grateful because they're going to know that you're available when they need you. And your coworkers are going to be so grateful because some of them are going to feel more empowered than ever because you're giving things away and you're trusting people. And your employees are going to be so grateful because they're going to have a boss who is available when they need to get your attention. Why? Because you live wisely. You live wisely. You create margin because you understand that your time is limited. So you limit what you do with your time. Let's pray. God, I'm just so grateful that you are concerned and that you care about the details of our lives, all the way down to our schedules and how we manage our time, how we use our time. That you've spoken into this and given us a pathway forward to living with margin. You have given us a perspective that can change the way we use our time. So grateful, God, that these words that Moses wrote 34 or so hundred years ago are still just as relevant today. It's amazing to think about. And so we just say thank you for this remarkable insight that Moses has given us. So God, we just pray what Moses prayed all those years ago. Teach us to realize the brevity of our life so that we may grow in wisdom. And we pray this in your name, Jesus. Amen. Thanks so much for coming out this weekend, guys. We'll see you next week for week 4 of Going Under.